So I am delighted to be joined today by a very dear friend of mine all the way from Florida, Dr. Helen Turnbull. And Helen, you and I met, I think, originally over 10 years ago when we were both working on a leadership program for a very well-known pharmaceutical company in Basel, Switzerland. And Helen has become my go-to person. So when I'm looking for help or I have issues with unconscious bias, Helen is the expert that I turn to. Helen has written the book, The Illusion of Inclusion. Her TED Talk on unconscious bias has been very popular. And Helen is, as I said, just my go-to person. So it's a real thrill for me to be joined by Helen today. So welcome aboard, Helen, from Florida.
Thank you, David. It's really a pleasure to be with you. And I remember fondly our work together in Basel, Switzerland, and we've been solid friends ever since.
So Helen, we're doing this series, Meet the Thought Leaders, as you know, and you're the thought leader on unconscious bias. And it's a word that, we hear more and more and more frequently used. But I'm not always sure that everybody understands what is unconscious bias. So I'm going to kind of introduce the idea of unconscious bias by saying to you, Helen, I know that you have a thing about pilots, because over here in Ireland, we say, I have a thing, okay, and I know you have a thing about pilots, okay? And in that pilot story, you can gently introduce us to unconscious bias. So tell us about pilots.
So, yeah, there's a lot of ways I could answer that, but I will tell you the story. It was about, I think, 15 years ago, and I was boarding a flight from Dallas, Fort Worth to Fort Lauderdale on a Friday evening at 8:15. So I was very keen to get home. And as I boarded the flight, it was in the days, it must have been before 9/11 happened, because it was in the days when you could look into the cockpit as you boarded. And as I looked into the cockpit, I realized there was a woman sitting behind the pilot seat. And I thought, oh, there's a woman going to fly this 757 back to Fort Lauderdale. And as I sat down, my stomach began to turn, and I began to have this almost panic conversation in my head that maybe I should get off the plane and book a hotel and stay overnight and take a flight the next day. And I sat down and I thought, now, hold on a minute, Helen, you're not meant to think like this. You're a diversity consultant. You're meant to know better than this. And so I began to look at what mental models, what mind viruses was I carrying that made me have that kind of feeling. And I realized in that moment that for me, a competent airline pilot was tall, was white, was male, had silver gray hair, looked like he was ex-military, maybe Navy or Air Force. Now, he could fly the plane. I wasn't sure that she could. Now, obviously, she got me home safely, or I wouldn't be here to tell you the tale. But it made me take a serious look, David, at how our unconscious biases show up and the multitude of mental viruses, mind models that we carry that we're not cognitively aware of all of the time. And one of the things I do believe about unconscious bias is that you never overcome it. You just have to manage it, that it sits in the back of your neck. And in order to become a little bit competent, you have to become aware, as I did, about my thoughts about female pilots and move it to the edge of your shoulder where you can actually see it in your peripheral vision. And then it can talk to you basically and say, no, don't make that decision. Because the thing about unconscious bias in recent years, it's become what I call trendy and sexy to say, oh, I'm going to unconscious bias training, or that was my unconscious bias that caused me to do that. And we can't use it as an excuse for our oppression of other people. But we also have to accept that we're never going to get rid of it. That particular mind virus revisited me about 10 years later in Sydney, Australia, when I was flying from Canberra back to Sydney. And again, it was a small commuter flight. And halfway through the flight, a woman's voice came on the intercom and said, "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Qantas. We'll be landing in Sydney in about 30 minutes. And as she spoke, I thought, wait a minute, there's a woman pilot. And I forgot to check But this time I was able to laugh at myself. This time I caught the situation. I didn't panic. I just thought, wow, isn't that interesting that that situation is still there for me? So yes, I mean, I would say that's a story against myself. And at the same time, I tell it because I want other people to realize nobody gets to be an exception to this work. All of us have it. We just have to work with it.
So if I hear you correctly, Helen, you're saying even diversity and inclusion experts, carry unconscious bias, and that one of the things that it could have gotten you to do was to change what you were about. In other words, I could get off the plane. Mm-hmm. So, in an organizational sense, obviously you're not getting off the plane, but you might say, I'll avoid that person. Yeah. I won't necessarily pick that person if I have a doubt. And you may not even be aware that you're doing it, but that this is something that we carry on. And I love the analogy there that you made, that at the back of your neck or the back of your head was this thought, and that by shifting it out to your shoulder, you became more aware. Because I'm just very conscious that right behind my shoulder is a crucifix, mm-hmm. That I deliberately put up there before we did this call. And the reason I put it up was that I wanted to talk to you about the idea of we're living in a very unusual time, all of us now, with Corona, in that we're inviting people into our spaces now in a way that we never did before. I'm in your home now, you're in my home now, and we're away from the sterile office setting. And one of the things that occurred to me on a call recently was how easy it could be for me to say, look at something like the crucifix that I placed there and jump to conclusions mm-hmm. about the person on the other end. So, it could be, I don't know, maybe I hear a child in the background and, you go and deal with it. And I say, maybe consciously or unconsciously, oh God, isn't she a great mother? Or, but she's not a great manager, so I'm making the point that Corona has opened up this new space for us that we need to become even more aware.
Yes, and it's very interesting. Two thoughts come to mind. One is that the space that's opened up, you are in my home right now, and I'm in yours. And at the same time, you're seeing what I choose to let you see. And so this little box that we're both in terms of television or Zoom screens, it is what we're seeing of each other. And I could make judgments if I could read the titles of the books behind you. I could make judgments about what I think you're interested in reading. And at the same time, what most people are not seeing is what's outside of the screen. So this can look very tidy, but the rest of my life could be disorganized. So I'm presenting my work face to you, as we all do. And my second point in that is that I was recently reading on Twitter a little video of an interviewee who was speaking on BBC television recently. And he was being interviewed. He's an expert on South Korean history. And as he was speaking, his, 2-year-old daughter wandered into the room. Now, the person interviewing him saw the daughter before the father did, but once she got to the desk, he pushed her away. He didn't even look round. He just pushed her back gently, and she was having none of it, so she pushed back forward. And at this point, he's looking uncomfortable. The interviewer is kind of laughing, and then the baby arrived on one of these little stroller things, and 2 seconds later, a woman arrived, and she pulled both children out of the room. And when I told that story the first time, I said the babysitter arrived. And someone pointed out to me that she was not the babysitter. She was his wife. And the assumption I had made is, and I was not conscious of it, was that because he was a white male and she was Asian, and she looked younger, to be honest, that she was the babysitter. And it made me realize it's another example of how easy it is to be an expert and still have these mind viruses that catch us out. And actually, it's one of my hot buttons is that people in this field, David, diversity and inclusion consultants, we can't walk around thinking that because we're experts that we've got a lock on this, because these things happen to us too.
So I suppose, to me, the metaphor is, I often think, we're recording this at a time when Cheltenham was about to start in England. And I often say to people, it reminds me of, horse racing. that, the blinkers that they put on the horse is, they're there to keep it focused only in one direction, and they block out peripheral vision. And in a sense, unconscious bias can be like that too. Those blind spots that,
Yes.
our vision is blocked and we're not seeing the full picture, which is exactly what you've just said. And then when that begins to impact, us in organizations or as individuals, it can have a fairly big effect.
Yes. Yes. And we have lots of blind spots that we're not aware of. I have fun with my audience when I do a keynote. I use live polling quite a lot. And one of the questions I ask is, in a shorthand, do you believe that your leaders create an inclusive environment? And people always say, well, kind of maybe, but not always. And then the second question I ask is, do you create an inclusive environment? And the score for that question is always higher than the score for what they think their leaders are doing. And the audience usually laughs. And I say, that's your first blind spot, is to think that you've got, you do this better than other people, because all of us are just vulnerable human beings. And we have to work on this. We can't just say, well, you know what, everybody's got unconscious bias, so be it. We have to do the work to catch the mind viruses and be willing to change our behaviors.
And Helen, is it fair to say that one of the things that's really important about unconscious bias is to say to people, you're not wrong, you're not broken, you don't need to be fixed, you're just being human. Mm-hmm. You're doing what we all do. That sometimes this can be, survival mechanisms, or, it's the way we keep safe, that we surround ourselves with people who are like us, is one of the tendencies that we have as human beings.
Yeah. I would answer you in two different ways. One is, it's correct. We're all just human, and we're not necessarily broken, unless, frankly, you're being overtly racist, and then I'd be having a different conversation with you. Yeah. I think the challenge is that, as if I were listening to that question, David, as a person of color, as a person who's gay and lesbian, I might be saying, wait a minute, I've been living with oppression my entire life. And the reason that it's not getting any better is because all of you good people who are in the dominant culture think you're not wrong and you're not broken. And so we've got a little bit of work to do. So I think that we walk a fine line when we look at our biases, particularly unconscious bias, is yes, everybody's got them, but that doesn't give you an exemption to not work on them, to not change them, and to not make some contribution to what we have to do to make systemic change in order to improve all of our lives.
So if we were to summarize that by saying, you're not wrong, you're not broken, but you absolutely need to be aware of the way that you think and how those thinking patterns can impact people and the space around you.
Yes. I mean, I would think, to use your metaphor, we're all as broken as each other in that regard when it comes to polite conversation with each other, but we absolutely have to take stock, and we have to hold ourselves accountable, and we have to be willing to lean in and stay the course. I think that white people have the luxury, we've had a lot of attention paid to the racial problems, particularly in the US, in the last year because of George Floyd. And I've been saying from the beginning, number one, as egregious as that was, it's not the first time it's happened. It's just the first time it was so egregiously caught on camera that it caught the imagination and the attention of the world. And number two, it's happened since then, and it's not getting the same press. And are we in this for the long haul, or are we just entertained and interested in it and want to be ambassadors and allies when the cameras are on? So the question is that for people of color, for people who are gay and lesbian, etc., they want us to be allies and partners all the time, not just when it's topical.
Not selectively.
Yeah.
Okay. Helen, one of the, you and I have worked long enough in business to know that sometimes, for organizations, the bottom line can be, return on investment, or, what's in this for me? How can we link the idea of, work on unconscious bias with better productivity?
So the Gallup poll every year, but in 2019, published their employee engagement results. And they said that 65% of the workforce is not engaged at work. And that 15% of that 65% are quote unquote sleeping on the job. So what I believe, and I say this to my clients, is if I could give you a 10 or 15% improvement in productivity, improvement in employee engagement, would you be interested? And I've never had a senior leader say no. And the reason I'm saying that is because I believe that if we could close the employment engagement gap, if we could improve the Gallup poll results by 10, 15% in a year, that we would gain on the bottom line. And the reason we could improve is by doing inclusion better. You know, because companies hire for diversity, David, and manage for similarity. So we bring in a diverse workforce, but we don't necessarily create the environment where these people are allowed to bring their best selves to work, which is what causes the disconnect in employee engagement. So if we could figure out not just how to hire diverse people, but how to manage the workplace so that people feel free to be themselves in a good way. I mean, listen, don't bring your whole self to work. I think there's pieces of all of us we should leave at home, but bring your best professional self to work and feel free to speak up. And if that would close that engagement gap in a hurry.
You, Helen, have, delved very deeply. Your PhD was this whole area. And I know that you have developed the inclusion complexity model. Help us to understand what are the forces at play in organizations, because that's what you looked at.
Thank you. So in my book, The Illusion of Inclusion, what I wrote about is that there are 7 characteristics that we need to be aware of. I called it the inclusion complexity model because inclusion comes across as a soft word. Nobody argues against it. Nobody says, no, I don't really want to be included at work. Everybody wants to feel included. And at the same time, it's much more complex than people realize. And so that there are 3 immutable forces that are never going to go away. And there are 4 permeable forces that if we understood them better, we could help to mitigate against them. And the 3 immutable forces, the first one is the issue of dominance, that there's always going to be a dominant culture. There's never not going to be a dominant culture. The question is, today, of course, the dominant culture around the world tends to be white people. The dominant culture could change in terms of the demographics, as there are more people of color in the world than there are white. The demographics are shifting in this country, which is part of what you're seeing going on here, but let me not go there. But you can see the pushback that people want to maintain power. You know, with being white in this country comes privilege, power, and difference. And so we really have to do the work to understand what these shifting demographics are doing around dominance. So dominance is the first thing we need to understand. Never going to go away, but you have to look at how you manifest your power and how inclusive you are being as a leader. The second issue we've talked about, in fact, is unconscious bias, because that's not going to go away either. There are people that believe if you know what your biases are, your unconscious biases, that you can stop them. That's not true. They'll revisit you because their mind virus is just sitting there waiting to show up. And the third immutable force is what I call degrees of difference, is that we tend to be a little bit binary in our thinking around diversity. Is like, let's address the gender issues in our organization, and we think male, female. But in actual fact, there's diversity amongst men that we're not always addressing, and there's diversity amongst women, and there's the whole issue that's an increasing conversation these days on gender identity, gender non-binary. And so men are diverse too. So that men are baby boomers, Gen X, Gen Y, men, there are straight men, there are gay men. The religion you mentioned earlier, Christian men, Muslim men, Hindu men, etc. And so we have to be willing to unpack what I call the vertical axis. Sorry, the horizontal axis. And so companies manage from the top down. That's sensible, and we're going to keep doing it. But we also have to manage each of the horizontal axes, because there are differences in each of these groups. People of color, as we use that term in the US, there are differences within the Black community. There are differences of skin color privilege within the Black community. There are differences in terms of the intersectionality. There's difference in terms of whether African Americans get along with people who are Latina. What is the attitudes that we all have about each other, and so if we're really going to want to be inclusive, all of that needs to be unpacked. So these are the three immutable forces: dominance, unconscious bias, and degrees of difference.
Right.
And then the permeable forces, there's four of them. The first one is affinity bias. And what that means is that each of us has an affinity for people who like us, people who share my values, people I'm comfortable with. I've never met anyone, David, who says, I think I'll go to work today and find some people I have no affinity with, because none of us really wants to do that. It's not necessarily the same race or the same gender, but you and I have an affinity because we're both Celtic. You're Irish and I'm Scottish, and we hit it off immediately because we're both, we both recognize our cultural roots. And I have to say, David, when you sang at the dinner that night with the client, I was sold. I thought, we're going to be friends for life when you have a voice like that. It was so much fun. But part of my response to you singing an Irish song was that you tugged at the heartstrings of my Celtic origins.
So just for anybody listening, what Helen's referring to is that when we were doing the program we did in Basel, or one of the programs, there was a dinner one night and everybody was asked to sing, and I sang an Irish song. And,
yes, yeah. But I mean, that I have never forgotten that, because it was such a strong connection for me. And so we have an affinity for people for lots of reasons. It doesn't necessarily have to be skin color or gender. It's about values in a sense, but that's never going to change. What I ask people to do is not to look at who you have an affinity with. Look at who you're rejecting. Look at who you're not seeing. Ask yourself, who is it in my department that I don't listen to? Whose accent gets on my nerves? Who is it that when they speak, I'm just like, yeah, right, okay. And ask yourself if there's a pattern there around who's not in your affinity group. The second permeable force is what I call assimilation. And that is what people of difference have to do to fit in with the dominant culture. So if I'm not a white male in the organization, what adjustments do I have to make to my style in order to fit in order to be acceptable to you? I was watching, if you haven't seen it, it won't mean anything to you, but I was watching the new Coming to America movie last night. And in that movie, they're teaching the young man who's about to become a prince how to walk in a princely royal way. And he finally concluded that the only way he could walk was the way he was walking growing up. And so the more he became authentically himself, the more comfortable he was in the new job he was getting. And so as entertaining as that was to watch last night, there's a huge grain of truth in how we ask people to, when I said we hire for diversity and manage for similarity, we're not always conscious that we're asking people to fit in with our style. Women tend to get feedback that they're too aggressive, or they're not aggressive enough, they're not assertive enough. And so what we keep doing is trying to adjust our style in order to make you comfortable. And you remember the days of Dress for Success when women used to wear these little bow ties, and we were allowed to wear pants at work and things. And all of that is an attempt to fit in rather than to bring our best self to the table. The third permeable force is the issue of political correctness. And when I was writing the book, I had come to the conclusion that political correctness wasn't helping the diversity conversations, that in actual fact, it was encouraging us all to walk on eggshells around each other, to not be willing to lean into a difficult conversation. And I was ready to say, all right, let's stop being politically correct. But it was around the 2015 when I decided that maybe we needed a little bit more political correctness. And so I decided to abandon the term political correctness in my book and suggested that we redefine PC as polite consideration.
Right, right.
That for me, if we would be willing to be curious about each other, if we'd be willing to be polite, I mean, I honestly think that there's a dire need in this country, at least, for a return to civilized behavior. You know, we've got people fighting each other over wearing masks or not wearing them. It's become, frankly, embarrassing and ridiculous, and that we need to return to a sense of civility. And so PC for me is now polite consideration. I don't necessarily have to agree with everything you say. I don't even have to like you necessarily. But if I'm willing to say we need to be polite to each other, we need to be considerate of each other, and we need to lean into the conversations and be willing to be curious and learn from each other. So, and the last of the permeable forces is a little bit more complicated because it's really the issue of internalized oppression or stereotype threat, where subcultural groups get lots of negative messages about who they are as a group. You know, that growing up in Scotland, people used to tell us that we were mean, that we were tight with money, but actually that is absolutely not my experience of being Scottish. The Scottish people are incredibly warm-hearted and generous, and we'd give you our last, not dime, but whatever, farthing, I guess. So you know, the stereotypes that people tell us about ourselves, we can turn them on ourselves and sabotage either myself or somebody who looks like me. So,
Right.
So these are the 7 characteristics.
And they're all, for anybody watching who's really interested in exploring unconscious bias at a deeper level, highly recommend Helen's book, and the model is included in the book. Helen, you brought 2 thoughts to me there as you were talking. One of them was an organization that I worked in with some years ago, and I had done some focus groups. And I was asking, in general, I said, how would it be for me coming to work here if I was different? And oh yeah, fine, no problem. And we have the policies and we have the practices, and they believed that they were very inclusive. But about 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from a lady who happened to be in the group, and she said, I don't know if you can remember me or not, but I was in that group. And I said, yeah. And she said, would it be possible to meet? And I said, sure. And I met her, and she said, thanks for meeting me. And she said, I asked to meet you because my colleagues gave you the impression that it was okay to be, different, and that we're very inclusive. And I said, yeah. And she said, I'm lesbian. She said, I live with my partner. We have a mortgage. We have a car loan. Our families know, our friends know. But she said, the people in work don't know and will never know. And I said to her, oh. And I said, what? And she said, I just wouldn't trust that if they did, that things will be the same for me. And I said, okay, that's a personal decision, how you choose to. But I said, how does it impact you? And she said, well, Dave, that's why I really wanted to meet you. She said, you have no idea the energy that it takes to be me. She said, I come to work every day. I be professional. I do what I have to do, but I don't get involved in committees. I don't get involved in anything other than what I have to do. And she said, I almost live a double life. And she said, it takes huge energy. And, and it just, your story, your model there just spoke to me. That idea of the energy that it takes.
That's right.
To fit in.
That goes back to the Gallup poll, David, is that's the issue, is how we can close the employee engagement when we can create an environment where she's safe to be herself and she's not holding back and holding on to that energy. I'll never forget interviewing a senior white male in Australia, actually, and we were talking about my unconscious bias to cognizant and his results. And we got to the issue of sexual orientation. And he looked at me and he said, Helen, he said, I arrived this morning from Hong Kong. He said, and one of my employees was on the flight with me. So we shared the rental car or the limo back to the office. He said, and I've long suspected that this employee was gay, but he's never told me that. He said, and in the car this morning, he told me that he was gay and that where him and his partner had been on vacation recently. And he said, you know what I did with that conversation? He said, I turned and looked out the car window for what felt like the longest time. And when I turned back, I changed the subject. Wow. And he said, I'm realizing, Helen, talking to you, the impact I must have had on him. And he said, I'm going to go back today and speak to him again. So, yeah, the energy is huge. And the energy, when we're not curious about each other and willing to open our minds, the energy is being used up on both sides of that equation. So for him, he tensed up when he was told. He looked out the window. He probably thought, now what do I do? And as he turned back, he changed the subject. And the impact of that is devastating, not just to the individual, but to whoever he tells that story to. So yes, I mean, if we could do this work, we could free ourselves up from a whole lot of tension.
There's another, again, you reminded me of another story, just speaking to what you have said there. I was dealing with a lady in Europe a couple of years ago, and we were, on a program we were working on. And at the end of the conversation, the way in this part of the world, we typically we don't even think about it, but I just finished the conversation by saying, God bless. I'll talk to you again, God bless, and hung up the phone. And it's just something we do. You know what I'm talking about. In this part of the world, I didn't even necessarily think about it. But anyway, I was talking to another lady who knows this lady afterwards, and she said to me, you can do no wrong in the eyes of the original, the woman I'd made the comment to. And I said, why? And she said, oh, she thinks the world of you. And I went, why? What did I do? And she said, you said God bless. And I went, and she said, this particular lady, was quite devout, and that had a huge impression on her. And it was a leveler for me, because I went, wow, I did that without even thinking about it.
Yeah.
But it had shaped the space between us. You were talking about affinity. It shaped the energy between, the two of us. It shaped the space that we were going to occupy into the future. And, it was a real lesson for me.
Yes.
About, how this happens in organizations.
Exactly. And it's a perfect example. And it could also have gone the other way.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So just as easily.
Yeah. So Helen, fascinated talking, and I could talk to you all night. One of apart from the work, your book, apart from the TED Talk, you have also developed a range of tools that you use with organizations. Just briefly tell us about those, so that viewers watching this get a sense of the tools that you have and how they can be used to help with unconscious bias projects.
Thank you. Yeah, I developed 3 assessment tools, all of them because I wanted leaders to have a way to measure the impact of their own individual behavior and their collective behavior on the organization. The first one is the ISM on inclusion skills, where I can help leaders to close the inclusion skills gap. The second one is the gender gap assessment, that's similar but focuses specifically on gender issues and how do we understand the biases and what conversations we need to have to close the gender gap. And the third one is cognizant. And cognizant looks at unconscious biases. And I've won several awards that my clients have won as a result of the work we did using cognizant to close these gaps in understanding. So each of the tools has a specific focus, but it's really designed to give people measurements, to have them say, yeah, look, you know what? That gap in thinking or behavior or skills does exist.
Right. And the tools help people not just to measure individuals, but teams and groups, and you can have composite reports of.
Yes, we pull aggregate reports for departments and for whole businesses. So.
Okay. And it's not, of course, just limited to Florida or the United States. These are all online and available.
They're online and global. Yes, we can work with people on Zoom, of course. I do most of my work on Zoom at the moment.
Okay, so Helen, in order to bring us towards the end of this conversation, you know that I love some of the words that you use, okay? And I love the kind of appreciative approach that you take to the work that you do. And examples of those words are innocent eye, unchallenged brain, our better selves. Earlier in this, you talked about our better selves. Help us to understand, what is that, there is no innocent eye. What do you mean by the unchallenged brain? And what do you mean by our better selves? How do we get our better selves?
Okay. So with the innocent eye, years ago, when I did my undergraduate degree at the Open University in the UK, and I had a professor there that said, there's no such thing as the innocent eye. He said, all of us see the world through our subjectivity, through our personal experience. So he argued that even when we say we're being objective, that our objectivity is seen through the lens of our subjectivity. That basically we're always socially constructing a story about what's happening to me and what you did to me and how you said that and what's your tone of voice and do you like me or not like me. And so I'm making decisions all the time and they're not objective and they're not innocent. And so that's what I meant by that. My favorite quote in the world is from Socrates, who said, "The unexamined life is not worth living," because I believe that we're put here with purpose of growing, with the purpose of examining who we are and how we come across and what we have to do to learn and grow. So I usually end my keynotes with Socrates said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." But I'd like to leave you today with the thought that your unchallenged brain is not worth trusting. And so what I'm really saying is you have to pay attention to all these thoughts you're having because they may not be right. And then the issue of bringing your better self or your best self to work is really that. It is that I do believe that we're not creating necessarily an environment in our teams and departments that allows people to bring their best self to work. People are holding back, and leaders need to be asking themselves, what am I doing that's causing everybody to have to comply to make me comfortable? So I don't know about you, but over the years when I've had a client or a boss, I pay close attention to what upsets them. I pay close attention when they look like they didn't like what I said. I'm like, note to self, don't do it like that again, right? Yeah. And so everybody's adjusting their style to make sure the boss is comfortable. And I think that if you're going to be a leader who values inclusion and values diversity, you have to be asking yourself, what am I doing to stop you from bringing your best self to work? And even have the courage to ask that question.
And encouraging our leaders to get the best, to make sure that I have the best people, that people are bringing them best selves to work.
Yep.
Brilliant. Helen, I am so delighted to have spoken to you. Anybody who would like to contact Helen Turnbull, it's humanfacets.com, or contact me here at Open Minds and I will put you in contact with Helen. But Helen, thank you so much. It's been really enlightening. And thanks for taking the time to join us today.
It was a pleasure. It was an easy conversation, David. I enjoyed every minute of it. So thank you.